Thank you for joining us today to talk about border adjustments and our latest report. Border adjustments are a really hot topic in climate policy discourse right now, and the conversation is certainly moving quickly. So I'm really hopeful that our conversation today deepens your understanding about why and how these instruments can be used, why they're so important to climate policy. I'm Catrina Rorke. I'm the Vice President for Policy here at the Climate Leadership Council. I'll walk you through our work, and then I'm really thrilled to be joined by a panel of 3 experts who can deepen our conversation and lend their knowledge to us. We'll have Brian Flannery from Resources for the Future, Xiuting Pomerleau of the Niskanen Center, and Sarah Stewart of the Silverado Policy Accelerator. Let's dive in. I'll say up top, if you have questions for me or for our experts, please drop them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We'll turn to them later in the discussion. So obviously this is a particularly relevant moment to be talking about border adjustments with world leaders set to kick off COP26 in just a few days. While we hope for continued progress at the international table, at increasing climate ambition, involving all major emitters, solving technical issues related to greenhouse gas reporting. Coming out of that conference, it's certain that significant work will still lay ahead of us in terms of charting a course for meaningful emissions reductions in international emissions and getting towards deep decarbonization. And we believe that there's going to be an ever-increasing focus globally and here in the domestic policy conversation about border adjustments as a necessary tool to meaningfully lower global emissions. So let's talk about why from a US perspective. The US economy today has a carbon advantage. We are much more carbon efficient than very many of our trading partners in how we manufacture goods. It takes 80% more carbon emissions to create the same dollar of value anywhere else in the world as it does in the United States. And that carbon advantage is today an unrealized competitive advantage. We realize that competitive advantage by holding overseas producers responsible for their emissions on the basis of their carbon intensity and allowing producers to start competing with that information in. With a border carbon adjustment, clean US manufacturers will increase sales, increase profits, drive more investment in the United States, create jobs in the US, and all of that is perfectly consistent with cutting US emissions and cutting global emissions. You can learn more about the Council's research in the space at clcouncil.org. So it makes policy sense, but it also makes political sense. Today, my colleagues at Americans for Carbon Dividends are releasing new polling data that shows broad bipartisan support for border adjustments in key swing states. And you can learn more about this polling at afcd.org. While a lot of the conversation to date has focused on opportunity in border adjustments, we've also heard a lot of pushback related to how complicated some folks perceive border adjustments to be. And I want to talk about the strong foundation that we already have to grow from in building border adjustments in the United States. That is the subject of the report that we're releasing today. Don't believe the hype. A BCA is doable. To tee us up, in order to achieve deep decarbonization of the global economy, we have to align climate and trade. About 25% of global emissions are embedded in international trade, and much of that subsection of emissions cannot be addressed with existing climate mitigation strategies. It is also a growing subset of global emissions, those emissions embedded in international trade. We need to find a way to address this deficiency. Properly designed climate policy can increase domestic production and profitability and lower greenhouse gas emissions if we introduce border adjustments. That means it's a really powerful tool to marry climate ambition, and economic success. It's a breakthrough for us. Border carbon adjustments are vital to a stable climate future. We need to find a way to implement them so that we can use this really powerful tool. And I'll argue here that the obstacles to implementation are overstated and surmountable. So let's start with steps to building a border adjustment. First, border adjustments become a whole lot easier if you marry them with a domestic carbon price for a few reasons. First, it ensures that the border adjustment is predictable and consistent with domestic policy. All of the manufacturers competing in the US market will face the same carbon costs. There's transparency, there's predictability, and we can leverage the full benefit of a border carbon adjustment if we're marrying it to this domestic carbon price. Crucially, we can also implement the border adjustment at the same time as a domestic carbon price and give domestic industries a level playing field from day one. This is really important for industries that are particularly trade exposed, have tight profit margins, engage in long-term contracting, ensuring that overseas and domestic producers face the same incentives from day one of a policy is imperative. And third, not least, if we're marrying a border carbon adjustment to a domestic carbon fee, we can design it to accord with our international trade obligations. Think of it as adjusting for an internal tax or fee at the border, something that is deeply consistent with WTO principles that very many of our trading partners currently engage in with instruments like a value-added tax, for example. So if we marry border carbon adjustment to a domestic carbon fee, we're already moving in the right direction. The second element that helps us move closer is that we already have a whole lot of emissions data. So in order to apply a border carbon adjustment, we need to know the emissions associated with bringing a good to our border so that we can price them. And those emissions are increasingly known. 40 countries around the world have mandatory reporting requirements on facilities, which gives us deep insight into emissions data, facility by facility, industry by industry. Voluntary reporting is expanding. Over the last decade, there's been a threefold, I think, increase in voluntary reporting. More than half of market capitalization currently engages in voluntary emissions reporting. 92% of Fortune 500 companies use the greenhouse gas protocol to voluntarily report their emissions. And then on top of that, international agencies track emissions for industries, for countries, for the electricity sector, and report that data annually. We have a whole lot of data that we can draw from, particularly for the most carbon intensive goods. Where we don't have data, we can use things like emissions factors. What is the mode of production you use to make this good? Data proxies. What is the carbon intensity of the electricity grid, for example? That can be deeply predictive of the carbon intensity of manufacturing. Other instruments like this can fill in gaps where we don't have terrifically precise data. And if we write and enforce the rules in the United States, we can include sticks if the data doesn't meet our high quality standards. So consider that an importer or an exporter might want to make a more precise claim about their emissions. They can do so if they have the data to substantiate what their emissions actually are. If we're placing rigorous standards on that self-reporting, it gives us deeper insight into emissions, where they happen by industry, by country, and it improves data transparency overall. A third element that's getting us towards border carbon adjustments is that we already have a terrific administrative foundation to build on in our trade sector. US leadership in building a border adjustment policy ensures that it's US lawmakers establishing the rules, US agencies enforcing them in a transparent way to the benefit of US industry. Our existing trade system relies on detailed product information and disclosure. Every time a good crosses the border to the US, an importer has to disclose what the good is and where it was made. Border agents use the harmonized tariff schedule. It's more than 4,000 pages long. It has really detailed information on specific products, and use it as a lookup table to see if there's a tariff rate that would be associated with that good from its country of origin. We're not introducing any more disclosure at the border to implement a border adjustment. We're just adding a line item to an existing commonly used lookup table. We also have strong enforcement tools. At the Department of Commerce, the International Trade Administration Office of Enforcement and Compliance already conducts investigations into firms, inspects facilities, introduces remedies. We have tools in the existing trade system that we can draw on to improve transparency and ensure fairness in the system. And the Department of Justice enforces civil and criminal penalties already in the trading system. For the export adjustment, we also have a model to learn from. We have a series of excise taxes paid on fuels in the United States. If you export a fuel that paid an excise tax, we already refund that. That is a system that we can learn from to ensure that we can apply an export adjustment under a border carbon adjustment regime. So we have a lot already to grow from. Part 4 is that contrary to this concern that introducing border adjustments might spark a trade war, we'll suggest that we're moving in this direction emphatically. Border adjustments are a crucial way to increase global climate ambition and stay consistent with existing trade agreements so that we can leverage fair and open trade to the benefit of decarbonization. Ultimately, what we're talking about here is a path to improving multilateral cooperation on the climate front and on the trade front. And we can move towards cooperation with close climate allies in the form of something like a carbon customs union or other arrangement that allows us to enforce common trade rules with our partners. It's not just the United States. The European Union introduced its carbon border adjustment mechanism as part of its Fit for 55 package. We know that the European Union will have some form of border adjustment in the future. The administration and Congress have expressed interest in border adjustments, and we've heard from government officials in Canada, UK, and Japan the same. These are really big consumer markets. Taken together, the jurisdictions that have expressed interest in border adjustments make up 53% of the global economy. The richest consumer markets in the world are moving to align climate policy and trade policy. It is inevitable and it's crucial that we get this right. Now, there are still challenges. We have to resolve several things, and we can move closer to better border adjustments if we do so. First, we want to expand emissions reporting standards to more countries and more industries. We do have a lot of data, but we want to make sure that people are comfortable with how we collect and report data, how we associate that data with individual goods, and make sure that we have a strong footing so we can really compare apples to apples on emissions across products. We also need international negotiations to start engaging with this systemic challenge in misalignment between climate and trade goals. To date, the UNFCCC has sort of avoided the trade dimension. The World Trade Organization has sort of avoided the climate dimension, and we're failing to resolve this issue. With 25% of emissions embedded in global trade, it is absolutely critical that we move forward so that we can leverage liberalized global trade toward our climate goals rather than seeing them in conflict. Coming up, of course, the UNFCCC, the COP26, provides a great venue to launch this multilateral engagement, and the World Trade Organization has also started considering how to move forward here. And in conclusion, border adjustments are coming. The US can pair a carbon fee with a border adjustment, and we can deliver great emissions reductions and economic success to the US economy, launching a new era of global climate and trade cooperation in a new vein. We have the data, the expertise, and the enforcement capability to design and implement border adjustments, and it's in our strong interest to spearhead the design of these border adjustments and shape the future of international trade so that it is to the benefit of clean US industry. That's our case. Now I'll turn to our panel of experts to broaden our conversation and for their responses to the paper. Shutang Pomerleau is a climate policy analyst at the Niskanen Center, where she focuses on policy development for carbon pricing. Prior to joining Niskanen, she worked in public policy at the Cato Institute and the American Council on Renewable Energy. Welcome, Xuting. It's really nice to have you here today. Brian Flannery is a visiting fellow at Resources for the Future. He has worked on climate and energy issues since 1980, when he joined Exxon's Corporate Research Laboratory, where he conducted research and organized international workshops and symposia dealing with climate-related science, technology, economics, and policy. Welcome, Brian, and thank you for joining us. And Sarah Stewart is the Executive Director of Silverado Policy Accelerator. She has nearly 2 decades of experience as an international trade lawyer, policy expert, and negotiator. Prior to joining Silverado, she led the public policy efforts at Amazon on US trade policy and export control matters. Before that, she worked for the Office of the United States Trade Representative, where she was the Deputy Assistant USTR for Environment and Natural Resources. Thank you, Sarah. As a reminder, we will be taking audience questions. You can add yours in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And Xuting, we'll start with you. Thanks.
Thank you, Catrina. I'd like to first start by congratulating Catrina and the team at the Climate Leadership Council for releasing such an important report. Carbon border adjustments is a very important topic. It's also a complicated topic, so we need all the smart people we have to be working on this topic to figure it out. I quite enjoy reading the report Catrina authored. And as I was reading the report, I was like, yes, I agree. So I took some notes. I would like to first reiterate some very important concepts and points here. And then I'll go into some challenges that might happen with some of the proposals in the report. So the first point I like to reiterate is border adjustments must be implemented along a carbon tax. Oftentimes, I think carbon border adjustments are discussed in a context of a standalone policy. I got the questions a lot. Is border adjustment feasible? Is it doable? Is it happening? The short answer is yes, if it goes with a domestic carbon tax. If there's no domestic carbon tax or carbon pricing policy, there's really nothing to adjust at the border. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. Second is border adjustments is actually not something new or unique to a carbon tax or the climate policy area. As Catrina pointed out just now, a value-added tax, a consumption tax has been implemented around the world by more than 150 countries. So that's are fully border adjusted with an import tax on imported goods, export rebate on exported goods. Now, another way to think about border adjustments is even though the United States doesn't have a VAT, it does have state sales taxes. The state sales taxes are implicitly border adjusted. Now, the state borders are similar to the concept of country borders. The principles are here are the same. Take 2 states, for example, Ohio and Maine. Products produced in Maine but are purchased by consumers in Ohio would be subject to the state sales tax in Ohio, not in Maine. So I think that would be a really helpful way to really understand the consumption-based or destination-based principle in border adjustments. Another very important point, I think Catrina's report did a really nice job summarizing the high-level data sources for carbon emissions data, whether it's country level or facility level, industry level. I like to emphasize that product level data is key if we want to implement border adjustments, if we want to have a successful mechanism to go with domestic carbon taxes. As Catrina mentioned, we have a lot of readily available data at different levels. It will require different stakeholders, corporations, governments, associations to really crack at it, work on it to figure out how to come up with accurate and reliable product level data for the implementation of carbon border adjustment. The next point I want to mention is the report talked about the administration side of the carbon border adjustment. For example, what kind of agencies, enforcement tools, existing structure, processes. I like to add one point to the administration side of this discussion. That is, I think looking at the administrative burden of implementing carbon border adjustments is also very important. Looking at the administrative cost incurred by the government to implement such a policy in proportion to the revenue that it can raise. This is typically closely tied to the research question when it comes to carbon border adjustment is product coverage. With all the existing carbon border adjustment proposals, there's typically just a select list of goods or a threshold, carbon intensity threshold, because typically the concept or the belief is if we just cover every single good, including a car, laptop, phone, a bag of potato chips, it would be administratively too complicated to do that, and we can't afford to do that. But actually, I think a good design, a well-designed carbon border adjustment needs to be broad-based. If we're only covering a certain list of goods and not covering other goods, might give corporations opportunities for tax evasion or tax avoidance, and also from the perspective of tax policy. Typically, a broad-based tax policy is better, less distortionary than limited-based tax policy. So I actually released a paper earlier this year looking at the empirical estimates on the administrative burden on carbon tax. Unfortunately, there's not much. The closest estimate is the GAO's modeling of a hypothetical US VAT back in 1995, and they found that the customs administering a border adjustment, broad-based one for a US VAT, the administrative burden of that would be about 1% of the total administrative burden of such a policy. And that tells us that it might not be as onerous as a lot of people think to have a broad-based border adjustment. But of course, there's always a trade-off between the effectiveness and minimizing the administrative burden of implementing the policy. And I would recommend government agencies like GAO to do more research on the administrative burden side and provide more data and further analysis. I would like to go into the discussion of the potential challenges with two proposals highlighted in the report. I think Catrina brought a very good point that the non-discrimination global trade rules might impose some challenges on different countries around the world when they are trying to navigate between trade and following the rules with the non-discrimination provision. Though I would say that there might be some challenges to attempt to revise the global trade rules. The first one is, I think a majority, if not all members of WTO would need to be on board, and that might be a challenging process. And I also think that if we change the global trade rules, we might risk opening the floodgates for some other forms of protectionism in disguise. The WTO rules have allowed countries around the world to grow in prosperity since it was in place. And also there's a way to design border adjustments that would be compliant with WTO rules. So those are the challenges that might be we need to deal with if we trying to go through the route of trying to change the existing global trade rules. The last point I would like to make is the report mentioned a concept of carbon custom union. I think it's similar to a climate club proposal that has been floated around by many people. It mentioned that if such a carbon custom union is successful, maybe members in such a union would not need to impose border adjustments on each other. I would point out that the challenge with that is the domestic carbon price and the border adjustment would need to be entirely 100% identical among the members for it to work nicely, including the tax rate, tax base of such a policy. And another challenge is if we exempt some countries within the union of border adjustment, but not others outside of the union, transshipping would actually be a big problem. Companies in other countries might have an incentive to just ship to multiple countries to that country that is exempted from a border adjustment to avoid paying for the import tax. So that's the consideration there. So I think another way to think about it is it might be easier to just apply equally on trade partners. I'll conclude by saying I agree with Catrina that border adjustments are coming. It's an important topic, and I look forward to working with all of you on it. Thank you.
Thanks, Yu-Ting. You brought up some really relevant issues related to taking the emissions data we have and sort of tethering them to goods. Luckily, we have one of the leading scholars in this area on the line. Brian, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. A lot has been said already that I might have said, so I can home in on a few other issues. I thought your paper was excellent. And I think it's also good that you're discussing this with so many people, because I think we need to acclimatize people to what this is about and become comfortable with it. I've been working on this now for about 5 years with a really good team. And it kind of surprised my colleague Jan Meers and I, who have just released 2 new reports on how you would actually evaluate the product associated emissions to apply the border tax to. And we've come to the conclusion that it's just accounting and we know all the information. It's known or knowable. And most of it's reported publicly, as you pointed out. So I think some of these barriers that people had, that it's just too complicated, are beginning to go away, which isn't to say that there aren't political and legal and administrative challenges left. But like you, I think we have to find a way to address them. And getting into conversations with people in companies, people with interests aside, is really important to the development of this process. So I started working on this in 2016 or 17 with a colleague, Jan Meers, at Resources for the Future. We were both strong proponents of a greenhouse gas tax. I say greenhouse gas, not just carbon, because I think we need to do them all. But we don't think there would be one unless you had border adjustments. And I think it's proving to be true. If we could overcome the hurdles to designing the greenhouse gas tax, there would be bipartisan support for border adjustments. It's not a business issue alone. It's a labor issue very strongly. And it's an issue in the communities where these major industries are often the linchpin for cities, regions, states. So it has a very strong political constituency to address. Even though it may not be that big a deal to overall emissions, it's concentrated in a few very important places. The team that we assembled, Jan and I both have a lot of experience with industry. I worked very hard over the years on issues associated with measuring and reporting greenhouse gas emissions in companies and developing reporting protocols for whole sectors. That effort took about 5 years, from the late 1990s through the early 2000s. Initially, I thought it might take another 3 years to develop the border adjustments, but I no longer believe that. I think we have all the information we need. We need to account for it properly. The team we assembled included 2 really good trade lawyers from Georgetown University at the time. Jennifer Hillman, who in fact was a judge on the appellate court of the WTO, which only had 7 members. So she's a mover and shaker in this field, and Matt Porterfield, who is a really deep WTO academician, I would say. Both of them are lawyers by training. Jan and I aren't, well, Jan is a lawyer too. Okay. Jan and I have a lot of experience with industry. Jan has great experience with government, including he supervised the group who conducted investigations in foreign countries about dumping issues. And I think that's a highly relevant capability to have, because the data may not be reliable and we will need to look after it, certainly in some developing countries, but not only in developing countries. We were not working on the economics. We were not working on the issues for greenhouse gas emissions. We were asking the question, can you develop a WTO compatible border adjustment and will it be administratively feasible? And the conclusion we've come to is yes. There are three big sets of challenges, WTO. The primary challenge is it legal at all? And I agree with Shuting, and I think you said something similar, Catrina. With a tax, you can do it. With some of the proposals that have been made recently, it's not clear they'll be legal under WTO. Doesn't mean they won't go ahead. People might find a solution, but we found the solution if it's based on a tax. Second, there are lots of products and lots of countries participating in trade. So there are administrative issues, and they aren't going to be one-off. They're going to change year by year. It's going to need to be followed carefully. And third, a fundamental issue that many of the proposals don't address, but that you both have, is border adjustments don't apply to facilities. Our reporting obligations apply to facilities. The EU ETS applies to facilities, but border adjustments apply to products. A refinery produces several dozen products. You have to apply how you do it with each one. And as you said, Catrina, there are tools available, but how do you incorporate this new issue within them? So we devised a concept and an administrative tool we call the Greenhouse Gas Index. A border adjustment is simply, a border tax adjustment is the greenhouse gas tax multiplied by the greenhouse gas index of the product. We modeled GGI, as both of you have mentioned, we modeled it very explicitly after VAT. So it sits in the wheelhouse of being compliant with WTO. It tracks the taxed sources of emissions through the supply chain and through the operating facility to tell you what the total amount of taxed emissions were that were required to create the product. And we think that will work with BAT. We think that will work compliant with WTO because it is so closely modeled after VAT. I'm not going to go into detail. We've published now 10 papers on the subject, and you're welcome to look them up. I'm sure you can find them by looking me up or others of our colleagues. But what we now have are proposals based on regulations, not products. The EU ETS, the EU's proposal assigns the price of EU ETS allowances to imports. It isn't clear to me that they've said how you set the amount of emissions associated with the import. But if you did, you still face some methodological questions. The price is variable. Currently, the EU ETS has free allowances in some sectors, and they differ in different sectors. Addressing the methodological questions objectively is really important for WTO compliance, and I think broadly for acceptability. But we've come to the conclusion that if you could overcome those legal and methodological obstacles about setting the price, that you still need a tool to apply that price to products. And we think the Greenhouse Gas Index could do it again, possibly with some modifications to account for differences in the overall procedure. So I think we have a system that can work. The data is available. We've come to the conclusion that it's simply accounting, and in the facilities and other places, we do a tremendous amount of accounting and reporting already. This could map into that. It's doable, but there is a challenge to getting nations to agree to it, even if it is WTO compatible, because some nations would be hurt by this, even if the US potentially would be advantaged in some sectors. So that's a bigger question. It's good that we're getting into this discussion and debate now. And I think that's a really important thing because we learn a lot from these discussions. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Thanks,
Brian. Yeah, in the aftermath of the European CBAM, there was a quote in Reuters from the Rosneft oligarch, I guess, saying that the CBAM would hurt Russia's prosperity more than the economic sanctions presently imposed. An interesting parameter to consider while approaching the international dimensions here. And fortunately, we have a trade lawyer and negotiator on the line who can speak more to those issues. Sarah, please.
Great, thanks, Catrina. I'm so pleased to be here talking about this topic. It's been top of mind for many of us for a long time, but finally top of mind for policymakers and others in Washington. And I just want to commend the great work that CLC has been doing to both highlight the US carbon advantage and with the release of this report showing that, not only is a BCA viable, but it's actually likely inevitable. When we're thinking about the goals of a border adjustment mechanism, number one, to level the playing field for carbon output so that domestic producers can benefit from the carbon advantage. And number two, to hopefully drive an overall reduction in emissions globally. It's actually quite remarkable that we don't have a mechanism in place already, given the importance of these goals to the United States. What struck me when I was reading your paper is that there's actually quite a number of ways that a border adjustment could be structured to promote certain outcomes or to address particular concerns. I know that you've put forth one path focused on a carbon fee, but I think that the fact that there's many other permutations that exist gives me a lot of hope that there is a bipartisan path forward of maybe mixing and matching, different tools together. I wanted to highlight a couple of really important aspects of your paper. And the first is really near and dear to how Silverado has been thinking about this whole issue. And we've been, working on a holistic model called net zero trade policy. And it's really a holistic look at how you can create the right sets of carrots and sticks to drive the outcomes that you want. And I think that although your paper focused predominantly on the CBAM, you also raised important questions about a carbon customs union, whether and how the US should address developing countries. And I think that while there are challenges in that approach, and I think Shooting and Brian raised some of those, it's really important if we think about what is driving different countries to meet their climate commitments or not. So the first piece of this is using trade to reward like-minded countries. I think there's different ways that you could structure a club. One way is to say peace clause among, the membership on, pointing a carbon border adjustment mechanism at one another. But there's other ways too. It could be freer or more liberalized trade on environmental goods and services among that set of countries, or it could be deepened cooperation among those countries on certain things. Whatever it is, there needs to be enough of an incentive in that group of countries that they want to stick with high levels of environmental protection and enforcement, and that other countries who aren't there want to upgrade their membership to get there. So the second piece is that the Carbon Club or the Carbon Customs Union can't stand on its own. And that's where the CBAM comes in. If done right, I think, and in conjunction with the Carbon Club, where members don't impose the CBAMs on one another, this can act as a leveler as well as an incentive. And then finally, an area that we haven't talked much about today, but I think is really, really important as we're thinking about this is how is the US going to address developing countries? Because there are, when we looked at the scorecard that came out this morning and, 5 countries account for half of the emissions and then all the other countries account for the rest. And there are a lot of developing countries that need help to climb the ladder to meet their climate commitments. How are we going to do that? I think trade offers us some really interesting mechanisms to do that, potentially exchanging tariff relief for developing countries buying US goods and US environmental goods and technologies instead of other countries to help them climb that ladder. There's other options as well. Couple of other points on your report. I think you're dead on in talking about expediency. If we let other countries write the rules on this, our companies and our exporters are going to be at a severe disadvantage. And a lot of the criticisms that we're hearing from domestic industry who's worried about not only having to pay their own carbon tax or be subject to a price, but also have imports potentially be more expensive. Well, I guess I would say to that, those are real things that we need to think about. But if we design it in the United States, we can try and address some of those concerns. If we are merely reacting to what other countries are doing, that puts us at a competitive disadvantage. Consistency with trade agreements, obviously, this is a big top of mind issue. In my own experience working on environmental cases, I believe that there is a way to design and to implement this that could both ward off a challenge, especially if done with a number of other countries, but also withstand a challenge, even if there are tweaks that need to be made to the measure as a result of it. Data availability and verification. I love what you're proposing in terms of, not delaying on the measure until we have perfect data, because that's not going to ever be the case, but providing a mechanism for rebuttal of a benchmark and being able to provide information that actually can be verified. I think that is extremely, extremely important. And I would just raise a couple of other quick things for consideration. One is, to the extent that we are going to be looking at a mechanism where it's not a market price, but rather a tax or a fee that is paid to the government, we should also be thinking about what the government is going to be doing with that revenue that it's generating. And I think a lot of people would say, well, that's going to pay for the infrastructure package, or that's going to pay for this. But we should also be thinking about how it could be reinvested to help U.S. utilities and companies and workers who are going to be impacted by all of this. And finally, we should be creative in thinking about if in designing this, we should have a multiplier for countries that are directly contributing to structural excess capacity in carbon intensive sectors. And if you are driving that excess capacity and excess production to meet no demand, then you are putting unnecessary emissions into the atmosphere. And maybe there is something that needs to be done there as well. So thank you so much for having me and for your excellent work on this report.
Thanks, Sarah. Again, we're going to take some questions from the audience. If you want to drop them in the Q&A feature, that's great. Shuting, I have a question for you. So I think we agree that a carbon price is the best way to build a border carbon adjustment, but it is unlikely to be the sort of next thing that the US does on decarbonization. So assuming that that's the case, what can we do to introduce something like a border adjustment or keep moving the ball forward on the remaining challenges to implementing a border adjustment in the interim?
That's an excellent question. Thank you, Catrina. I think, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, the key to carbon border adjustment is you have to have a domestic carbon tax. In my opinion, it doesn't really make sense to introduce any form of carbon border adjustments if there's no such a domestic carbon tax. Think of it as in the context of tax policy. If you're not putting an explicit price on per unit of emissions economy-wide, I'm not sure why we need to adjust anything at the border. So I think I recognize the challenges of introducing a carbon tax in the United States. With that, I think discussion or any work on carbon border adjustments is actually going to be very helpful in driving the conversations on introducing a carbon tax, a border adjusted carbon tax. And we can communicate with lawmakers and the public on why a border adjusted carbon tax would be helpful compared to alternative policies, whether that is standalone carbon border adjustment. I rather cut a tariff if there's no carbon tax domestically, or regulations like what are the advantages or benefits of a border adjusted carbon tax compared to the alternatives.
Thanks, Jute. Brian, in the green room earlier, you mentioned that you had attended 24 of the COPs to date. The next one launches this weekend. How do you envision border carbon adjustments, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, the broader issue of climate and trade fitting into the discussions, either on the formal agenda or sidebar conversations at the upcoming COP?
Thanks. It's a very good question. And I do wonder too. Unfortunately, I'm going to miss this one also, but I think it's going to not be a bad thing because I think it's going to be a very difficult meeting logistically as well as the negotiation. First, the Paris Agreement put in place a set of nationally determined contributions, which nations were free to set. Developed countries had to come forward with an emissions reduction proposal, but developing countries, whatever they wanted to put in. And that's what we agreed to. Now we're saying, several countries, oh, by the way, we want to tax your imports that come from you or impose a fee. Well, we didn't talk about that in Paris. And the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement have very strong language about common but differentiated responsibilities, and that measures to take in combat climate change, including unilateral ones, should not constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or disguised restriction on international trade. That was put in about 1990 when the negotiations started. So I think we face a big challenge because a number of nations will be hurt by this. We exported our manufacturing capacity, and now we're saying, oh, by the way, we want to tax it. I think they have a strong case that this is outside what we had agreed to, and so there's going to be pushback. We've already heard it. And about a decade ago, the EU tried to impose the EU ETS on international aviation, and there was very strong pushback. It wasn't a polite discussion or an academic discussion. The clincher was, I think, when China said to Europe, oh, we're not buying the Airbuses that we contracted to buy. And at that point, it fell apart. I think we're going to see something like that. This will be discussed and at meetings just ahead of the COP. But as far as I know, it's not officially on the agenda, just like carbon pricing has never been part of the agenda of the UN Framework Convention. So the question will be, do people want to put it on the agenda and discuss it, or do they want to make this the basis of an agenda fight? It could be very difficult, or it could be an open door to setting a better discussion in place. I don't know, but everyone is not in favor of border adjustments, and there will be winners and losers, and it will become a big challenge to the negotiators. I like what Sarah said about having coalitions of the willing with carrots, not sticks. I think that's the way to get people in. But it's probably not the way to get China, India, South Africa, Brazil, major developing countries with large growing economies into the process. It's going to be a more difficult challenge. There are other ways to address it, but don't minimize the challenge. And so I think the COP, it will certainly be discussed. Whether it's discussed formally under an agenda item or not is an open question.
Thanks, Brian. Sarah, in your remarks earlier, you alluded to other ways of using trade instruments to get at the carbon advantage, to connect climate ambition and trade. And I was hoping you could take some time to talk about other trade instruments. The border adjustment has been sort of like the focal point here. It has a lot of attention. There's more literature on it. And it would be helpful to learn if there are other instruments that we can sort of build up a literature on and start considering that help us achieve these goals.
Sure. And I think that this is actually an evolving area. It's something that Silverado is putting a lot of time into, and we're in quite early stages, but just to kind of, whet the appetite for what's to come and some of the research that we're doing. Yes, a carbon border adjustment is definitely one mechanism. And as I said earlier, even in that even among a CBAM, there's many, many permutations, but there are also existing laws that we have that we could be potentially considering in either conjunction with a CBAM or as standalone. So at the end of the Trump administration, there was actually a submission to the WTO calling for exploration of whether or not to use countervailing duty law to offset what the administration at the time was calling, essentially an actionable subsidy, where, the lack of environmental standards and lack of environmental enforcement is essentially an actionable subsidy. I think it's a really interesting and novel way of looking at things. We are in the midst of exploring that further. There's also, other safeguard remedies. There's the VAT system, there's import licensing. So there's various different things that have been used. I think ultimately what we're trying to achieve here in terms of leveling the playing field for US producers and, achieving parity in terms of pricing for carbon output probably warrants a more comprehensive solution that isn't a one-off, and that can really look at this holistically. But there definitely are some other mechanisms, and I think that, again, they could be used either alone or potentially in conjunction with whatever comes out of this debate.
That's helpful and interesting. I look forward to seeing what Silverado publishes on these other ideas. I've sort of laid out the case for why I think border adjustments, leveraging the carbon advantage, is really critical in the US. But again, we have the European Union moving forward with a policy in the form of a CBAM, expressed interest from our partners in Canada, the UK, and Japan. Why do you think right now all of these jurisdictions are starting to pay attention to this union between climate and trade and this sort of leverage point of introducing accountability for overseas emissions? And I'll open to anybody who wants to respond.
I think there's a very powerful reason why it's become suddenly such a hot topic. And credit to the European Union for this. They're looking hard at how they will actually achieve their 2030 target. They're looking really hard, and they're coming up with substantive proposals, and they're realizing, oh my goodness, this is going to be an issue in trade. It's going to affect our companies. It's going to affect our labor. And so I think the attention focused, because it really brought home that 2030 isn't that far away. And going into COP26, all nations are being asked to put forward much more ambitious goals for the long term. And a friend of mine from Japan said it's a beauty contest in proposals, but some governments are asking, how would I actually do it? And I think that puts the focus very strongly on trade. The EU ETS is 60 euros a ton these days. I mean, it was up over 50, I know. I don't know where it is this morning. US proposals, some of them were at 20, some at $40 a ton. But if you look at what it would take in 2030 or 2050, it's hundreds of dollars a ton of CO2. At that point, the implications for trade are just staggering. And the difference, not only in objectives of different nations, but the policy portfolio they're using is completely different across the world. So I think it's really caused people who are serious about achieving their objectives to think, what are we going to do and what does it mean for trade? So it's good that we're having this discussion now, because it's a very important discussion. And kudos to the EU, I think, for forcing that. A number of people have said part of their reason for their proposal is to force this discussion to occur. And we don't know what the final proposal will look like yet. So let's hope the discussions mature our approach.
Any other comment on that question, Sarah or Shooting? There's this great question from the audience, sort of from the perspective of other countries, manufacturers in other countries. how can countries with limited climate policy or pricing and manufacturers in those countries prepare for border carbon adjustments if they are coming down the pike?
That's the $1 million question. I think because where we are headed is towards a patchwork of different measures that are not harmonized to any degree that I can see at this point. And so I think it will be very difficult. And I think even in countries that have pretty sophisticated systems, they may also find themselves facing a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability. I think part of why it's important to look at a carbon club or carbon customs union is to have countries talking with one another about what this all looks like and trying to find a path forward that makes it predictable for everybody else who wants to get into the club. And I think it's also important, and this gets back to my point of how we approach the issue of developing countries, because a lot of countries don't have the tools to meet the climate commitments. And so they would instead just be, faced with multiple different border adjustment measures for their exports going into different markets. Think that there's a way to mitigate some of that by working with those countries and helping them to, not just from a technical perspective, but also from, what are the technologies and goods that you're using to reduce your emissions, to reduce your liability as you're exporting. So I think we have a long way to go on it. It's an excellent question.
And I would like to add quickly that from the perspective of corporations, whether it's foreign companies or domestic US companies, it would be really helpful to start thinking about carbon accounting. I think Brian mentioned this very quickly. I agree with Sarah that we have a long way to go, but it's happening. It's inevitable that decarbonization is happening, going green is happening. So I think doing carbon accounting, incorporating that into a company's strategic planning, including your investment decisions, looking at your carbon footprint, how would you invest in measuring and monitoring carbon emissions of your supply chain? How would you communicate with your upstream suppliers, downstream customers, why you are doing this, why this is important, and what benefits it would generate from doing carbon accounting. I wrote a quick blog post last year talking about, I envision a future of companies, maybe perhaps starting from multinational companies, maybe because they have more resources and capital, they could start integrating carbon accounting and financial accounting. I mean, they're doing this already, financial accounting with softwares, looking at their supply chain, working with their distributors, looking at products. It would be great down the road at some point, carbon accounting and financial accounting would be integrated at the same place, and management of corporations, they can look at this and then derive their decarbonization strategy.
That's interesting. Right, so if we have more than half of market capitalization already tracking and voluntarily reporting emissions, it seems like we're moving in the right direction. But there is this this persistent obstacle of making sure that we know and can agree on associating those emissions with the goods that we actually trade. And a lot of thanks to Brian for helping us simplify this into accounting terms. That's all the time we have. Thanks for focusing on this conversation, on the pathway that we already have laid out to a border adjustment, on the challenges that remain. Thank you for lending your expertise, Xiuting, Brian, and Sarah, and thank you to the audience for your participation. Really appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful day.